Alright, now that we know how to graph sine and cosine functions, the next thing to do is to be given a function and decide what is the equation going to be. And because sine and cosine are so related, you see they're asking us for an equation using the sine of the function, an equation using cosine function. To begin with, I gotta look at some of the things that I can label on my graph. So I'm going to start by labeling the maximum and also the minimum. And based on this, I should also be able to figure out the midline, which would be halfway in between the max and the min. So my maximum's at 1 and my minimum's at -5. That means that the midline should be -2. So I know this is my midline. That's helpful because if I go to what I need to determine, I already have some information to help me set up my equation. Basically, figuring this equation is graphing in reverse. I now know that the midline is at -2, which means m is y equals -2. I also know that the amplitude then, the distance from the midline to the maximum point, looks like it should be 3. And I know that my maximum was 1 and my minimum was -5. And that all makes sense so far. Things I don't yet know are the period and the scale. And I haven't decided whether it'll be sine or cosine that we do first. But I can tell that by looking at my graph. So since I know that this is the midline, and if I look at the y-axis, I see that this graph is passing right through the midline on the y-axis. The graph that I know that does that the best is sine function. So I'm going to use sine function. Now normally sine function should go up first, and this is going down. So I actually have more information. I know this is a negative sine function. That's going to be helpful when I have to write my equation. So let's begin. So far I know that this is going to be y equals negative, and then generally the first term there would be the amplitude. I already know that my amplitude is 3. So it's going to be -3. And then we said this was going to be a sine function of something. And we also know that it is going to be -2 at the end. So the only thing I'm not sure about yet is my period. Like, what is the period? So if I follow here, I know that period is going to be 1 complete cycle of the function before it begins to repeat again, which takes me here to 2 pi over 3. So I know that my 1 period is 2 pi over 3. Another way to measure that distance would be go from 1 maximum to the next maximum, or 1 minimum to the next minimum. All of those would be 1 period in length. But since I'm dealing with the sine function, I'm just going to look at this first cycle and base it off of that because I'm going from 0, so it makes it easier. So I know that the period is equal to 2 pi over 3. That doesn't really tell me what to put in my equation just yet, but I can say that since I know that 2 pi over b has to be equal to 2 pi over 3, I can figure out what my b value is. I've just rewritten this here. Based on this equation, my numerators match. In order for this equation to be true, b must equal 3. So if b equals 3, that means inside the parentheses, my b value is 3, and it'll be 3x. Now the last thing to think about would be, is there any shift? Well, no, because in the sine function, if it's starting at the midpoint, that means that there's no shift. Now when we talk about the cosine function of this graph, the cosine function would have to have a shift because we would imagine that in a normal cosine on the y-axis it would either be a minimum or a maximum, and it's not right now, so there is going to be a shift. But in order to answer the first part of this question, writing an equation using the sine function, working backwards from the graph, this is the answer that would be correct. Y equals -3 times the sine of 3x minus 2. The m term, you can tell by looking at the graph. The a term, you can tell by looking at the graph. Whether it's positive or negative, you can also tell. The b term is harder. In order to figure out what the b term is, you use the period and this little equation in order to figure that out. And really the scale isn't really important for us when we're going from graph to equation, because the graph has already been made and scale really only affects the graph. So there you have it.